So, global industry. What is the airline industry really, and what's the airline business? A lot of people categorize the service industry because we're dealing with people all the time, face to face. We're selling directly to the public. We're a retailer to a large extent. We obviously have service delivery issues. We have customer relationship issues, etc. So it must be a service industry. A lot of other people say, well, it's a hospitality industry because you're serving food. We've actually started our own catering division now. So we are a hospitality industry. We've got our own lounges. So we're running 3 airport lounges plus Slow in the city up the road here in the South Plain Hotel. So we're into that as well. Logistics industry, we've got to keep aircraft operating 24 hours a day. If they're not flying, they're in for maintenance or for cleaning or other aspects. And as we go through the presentation, you'll also see that everything is pretty much run on a minute-by-minute basis throughout the day. And there's actually no time for anything to go wrong. So definitely very much a logistics business, also in terms of how we sell, in terms of filling up the aircraft, how we carry cargo, the weight of the aircraft, how much we can accommodate for cargo, how much we can accommodate for passengers, etc. And the biggest problem we've had here is the historic situation that a lot of airlines have been government owned, and therefore they haven't operated on very good commercial principles. And consequently, the private airlines have had to compete with airlines that aren't operating on good commercial principles, and everything kind of gets dragged down in the process. So slowly but surely we're seeing, for example, in Europe at the moment, part of the EU regulations now that governments are not allowed to fund any airline within the EU because of competition issues. In the US, all the airlines have already been privatized. In China, there's still a lot of government-owned airlines, but there are very few private airlines, so it's almost not an issue. In South Africa, we've still got the same kind of challenge that we see in some parts of the world where the private airlines are competing directly against government. And that is a real challenge. And that comes back to this issue of protected competition and the fact that we do still have a number of airlines around the world, even the likes of an Emirates, who have actually got so much power behind them in terms of state funding that they are protected. They don't actually have to compete on pure commercial terms. Another problem is that it's a soft target for taxes. You find all around the world, whenever governments want to raise a bit more money, they introduce a carbon tax, or they introduce a tourism tax, or they introduce some other tax which the passengers on airlines have to pay. And it makes it very difficult for the airlines when they have to put up airfares. For example, now when the fuel price has gone up, as we've tried to put the airfares up, at the same time, AXA came along with a 70% increase for airport taxes, and all of a sudden the ticket prices shot up with AXA tariffs, and the airlines couldn't put the ticket price increase on top of that to recover the fuel cost increase. So these taxes are quite a strategic danger for airlines because they come in when you least expect it, and you've got to try and deal with that at the same time. Then costs, big issue, the fuel price, 35%, typically about 35% of an airline's cost is fuel. And that goes up and down like a seesaw. And in South Africa, it's not only the dollar cost of fuel, but the exchange rate as well that affects it, because we're obviously paying for fuel in rands. So when the fuel price came down from $127 a barrel earlier this year, it came down to about 105, 106. The rand price of fuel didn't move at all because the exchange rate went the other way at the same time. So we're affected dramatically by the exchange rate and by the oil price. The exchange rate also affects our maintenance costs, our aircraft leasing costs, even some of our catering costs where we've got equipment that comes in from overseas. And then the amount of regulation that's coming into this industry is also getting a little bit overboard. If you look at the kind of regulation around safety on aircraft versus safety on buses, for example, it's completely out of context. So there's minimal control over the safety on buses, and the amount of accidents and the amount of people killed on buses is huge. But if you look at the number of people killed on aircraft, it's minimal. But the amount of time and safety issues that go into the aviation industry is huge. Now, it's a bit of chicken and egg. Maybe if that regulation wasn't there, it would be worse. But if you look at the whole issue around the world and the amount of time and effort that goes into it, and the amount of work that's required of airlines to comply with things that actually aren't logical at all, this amount of regulation just becoming totally overwhelming for the businesses. So what's happening in the global industry? We are seeing larger but more efficient aircraft. We're seeing a whole new IT system generation, new ways of pricing airtime tickets, new products coming out there in terms of the way that services are sold to the public. We're seeing the merging of low-cost and traditional airlines because the low-cost carriers can't actually operate anymore with the kind of fares they used to sell. So they're having to start to sell into the more traditional markets, like the corporate markets, to get a better average airfare, because otherwise they're going out of business. On the other side of the coin, you've got the traditional carriers who are being chewed away at by the low-cost carriers, so they're having to reduce their level of service. So you find, for example, Iberia in Europe has now cut all their catering in the short-haul flights because they have to bring the costs down to compete with the low-cost carriers. So everything is coming back together again to a single airline model, which is where it all started off about 20 years ago before the low-cost carriers came into the market. And I think we'll see in probably 5 to 10 years' time there'll be a single airline model again. There won't be a low-cost and a premium model anymore. Skills shortage, specifically aviation skills and pilots as well, because historically all the pilots used to come out of the Air Force. At the moment, the Air Force is operating on real skeleton staff. In fact, Comair is actually flying a presidential jet because the Air Force doesn't have pilots to fly the presidential jet. So we're not getting any pilots out of the Air Force anymore. And the cost of training a pilot is typically around R500,000, and after that they have to go and get about 3 years worth of experience on smaller aircraft, and only then can they come back and get their jet conversion. And there's nothing coming through the channel anymore in terms of pilot production. There's training schools in South Africa actually training foreign pilots. They aren't training South African pilots. So what's going to happen there in the future, we'll have to wait and see. But what we have seen is every once in a while when the economy picks up globally, the likes of Emirates or Cathay or Etihad, or these guys come in here and they come and poach pilots from the South African market because they know that our pilots are pretty good, and they just walk in here, they recruit 50, 60 pilots at a time, and that's going to be a real challenge going ahead. So when you start off and you're in that sort of entrepreneurial stage, your diet in terms of the requirements of the business are very different to what your diet is for a business when it gets more mature. And that includes things like leadership structure. Until around 7 years ago, we had very much a centralized leadership structure where almost every decision in the organization actually went through the CEO. And there was very little decentralized decision taking, just because of the fact the organization was still quite small. But what was happening, of course, was as the organization grew, it became increasingly impossible for a central point to manage all decisions and to manage all strategy. And so we had to start working towards a decentralized structure. But it's amazing how difficult it is when people have become used to the fact that whenever they need something done, they go to the CEO and ask him what should be done, and not take the decisions themselves. So a whole change management process in terms of actually forcing people to think for themselves. And you find in the process some people can't do it, and you've actually got to replace some people. Other people adapt to it quite easily and say, well, we always wanted to do this. So it all comes back to people. And like I said, if you've got a really good challenge, it's a good place to be. Don't expect to get paid huge salaries, and don't expect to be able to put your feet up on a desk ever, because you'll be too busy running around trying to get things done. But it's an exciting business, and that's why I'm still here.